All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for your patience, and hopefully you've had a chance to top up a coffee or a tea or a water. For our final main session of today, we're going to invite the Digital Identity Transition Program from the DIA, led by Alan Bell, who has just come on video now. Alan has with him Emma, and I believe Tony's lurking somewhere in the background as well. So these guys have been on a pretty incredible journey in forming the government's response to the question of what should government's role be in digital identity. So an incredible amount of work has gone into debating, comparing, contrasting, cajoling sometimes, and getting this over the line. So you've done an amazing job there, Alan. Really do appreciate the hard work and the blood, sweat and tears that you've put into this. And some exciting developments for next year in terms of the cabinet paper, which I'm sure you'll refer to, that cabinet signed off earlier in the year, and a looming digital identity bill as well. So without me yabbering on, I'm going to hand over to you, Alan, and yeah, tell us what you're up to.
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Alan Bell. I'm Executive Director of Digital Identity in the Department of Internal Affairs. I want to start out by thanking Andrew and Dins and the members for their collaboration and assistance. Andrew's absolutely right. We have collaborated widely with many stakeholders in the private sector, public sector, NGO sector. We've taken a very iterative and collaborative approach to digital identity. What we're trying to do is understand where digital identity is going. We're trying to understand the benefits that digital identity can provide for citizens, for the economy, for government agencies, and trying to make sure that we are correctly reflecting those views through to ministers so we can realise the wide benefits that we believe are available. Andrew pointed out that there was a cabinet paper in July. It's quite right. It's available on our website. That's www.digital.gov.nz, www.digital.gov.nz. So you can go there and you can actually read the cabinet paper. It's full disclosure. In that cabinet paper, we highlighted that we thought there's a few things that New Zealand needs to put in place in order to begin to realise those wide benefits of digital identity. And they are, and what you're going to hear a lot about today, the Digital Identity Trust Framework. And that trust framework is a set of rules, standards, which will set the playing field, parameters, which people can actually play in a trusted environment. I was listening quite a lot to your previous speakers talking about trust being central to digital identity and central to digital generally. We couldn't agree more. Trust and confidence, and making sure that trust and confidence is embedded right within the center of any digital identity trust framework is actually critical. And we are very keen that we reflect that in proposals that we put to ministers. We've also talked about how we would test the rules. We don't want to just sit and wait for legislation to go through the House. That can take a wee bit of time. What we want to do is test those rules pragmatically with stakeholders. We put out a call to ask if there are any organisations that want to work with us to test those rules. We're still going through that process. We want to be able to be in a position where we can advise ministers of the rules that should come into play as soon as the primary legislation is passed, so we can get this thing up and running as quickly as possible. So that's a commitment that we've done, and we're actively seeking partners to work with us on that, and you'll hear a bit more about that as we work through. The other piece is, of course, we've been asked just to do another piece of work to look at government's ongoing investment in digital identity services, including the future of RealMe, and we'll be working through that process. That's on a slightly slower track, but we'll be working on that over the next few months, and we'll hope to provide advice to ministers in the new year on that. But I want to talk about, I was again listening to some of your previous speakers. I want to talk about the opportunities that digital identity offers us. If we can get this right, and I think COVID, obviously I'm sure you've had a lot of discussions about COVID and the impacts of COVID-19. It certainly brought into stark relief the need to get stuff online, the difficulty of face-to-face, the more efficient way that people can do this, the greater choice that people can have, and the need to have that trust and confidence built in all the way through the process if people are going to rely on using their identity in a much more easily accessible way, and a way which can actually ease their path to various services. If you think about border services, you think about travel corridors, there's lots of things here that come to mind that digital identity could potentially underpin, enable, and make happen. So we're certainly at the centre of a lot of discussions about how digital identity could be utilised by throughout the economy, in the economic recovery, in the COVID response. There's lots of things and lots of use cases. What we're not short of is use cases. I think what we need to do sometimes is streamline some of this stuff. I heard some of your previous speakers talk about the impenetrability, perhaps, of the language we sometimes use when we're looking at decentralized identities and talking about DIDs and talking about pairwise and all sorts of things that we talk about in the community. We've got to break out of that. We've got to get a lexicon that can engage with decision makers. I think I remember sharing a stage with Mr. Birch a few years ago where I made a similar presentation about, you know, I don't see much value in the same people talking to the same people about this stuff. We've got to widen the discussion, and we've got to make sure we bring in more and more people. But in order to do that, it's got to be accessible. We've got to talk about it in an accessible way. Slight hobby horse of mine, please forgive me. I just want to quickly finish my bit because Emma and my colleague Emma O'Connell will be discussing the trust framework in depth with you guys. But what I also want to just touch on is the international interoperability that we're working on as well. So there's a public commitment, prime ministerial public commitment to work towards interoperability with Australia and mutual recognition with Australia on digital identities. That is progressing. We're working as quickly as we can to see if we can get that aligned. It starts with alignment of trust frameworks, alignment and equivalency of rules and standards. So we're beginning to think, well, we're more than beginning. We've done a lot of work with our Australian colleagues on what that would look like. And we're working through. Lucky enough, Australia also plans to introduce legislation for its trust framework in 2021. And certainly that's what we flagged in the cabinet paper would be the schedule. It'll be up to ministers ultimately, but that's the advice we're giving to ministers on our trust framework. That interoperability discussions also extend to Canada and the UK. And we'll continue to discuss. Those are at an earlier stage. They're not as advanced as the discussions with Australia, but we're certainly having those discussions where we can, and exploring where we could potentially go. But look, I'm really excited by the opportunities that exist within the digital identity sphere. I'm really excited about the community we have in New Zealand. I reiterate my thanks to DINS and my thanks to DINS members, New Zealand Tech. I think there's been a great effort to coordinate some of the discussions, make sure they're focused on the right things. I think it's really important from a New Zealand perspective. When we look out, we're at the bottom of the world. We've got an opportunity here to take the lead in digital identity in certain areas, but make sure we're aligned as we go forward. I think it's very exciting for New Zealand. We have some inbuilt advantages being a unitary state that maybe other jurisdictions don't have. So we can get decisions. It's often said in Wellington, you can get decision makers into one room and you can get decisions made quickly. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but we do have an ability. We're more nimble. We have less moving parts in terms of states and provinces that we can actually just get things done. So I think there is a great drive. There is a great unity of purpose, and I think it's an exciting time ahead that we can look forward to in 2021. With that, and with reiterating my thanks to you all, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Emma O'Connell, and she's going to take you through the proposals for the Digital Identity Trust Framework. And then we're going to leave some room for some questions after the presentation. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. Ko Emma O'Connell, toko ingoa. I'll just start a share screen with you all, and can go through a presentation to just talk about the kind of the wider context beyond what Alan's shared with you, and to talk about some of the specific proposals as well. So hopefully we'll just talk for about 15 or so minutes, and then we'll have enough time for questions at the end as well. So first up, when we're talking about digital identity, we don't talk about it as the thing that you share around to prove who you are. Identity is obviously one part of it, which is, hi, I'm Lucy, up in the top right there. So proving who you are is definitely a part of it, but we're talking about a wider range of attribute sharing in this space. And so there's other things that you want to share. So you want to prove that you have eligibility to do something, such as buying alcohol. You want to prove you're over 18, or you want to show that you have the capability to do something. So that's where your driver's license comes in. Or you want to show that you've got the delegation, so you've got the authority to act on behalf of someone, as one example of that. So when we're talking about digital identity, we talk about that digitally enabled sharing of information, and that it's beyond just who I am, but it's more information that I want to share. That's just the kind of first context that we'd like to lay in there. So some of these kind of benefits of what we're trying to achieve within digital identity in New Zealand, we're wanting to move to a more trusted, coherent and sustainable digital identity ecosystem. So Alan touched on some of the benefits that provides, and this slide has a lot of words around those benefits, but the key thing is trust and confidence for citizens in particular, that they know what information is being shared about them, and they know what the standards that apply, so that's actually their information is protected. And also elements of having greater choice and control for citizens is something that we're wanting to enable from the changes we're proposing for the digital identity ecosystem in New Zealand. Equally, for businesses and agencies, there's a great opportunity to improve their ease of business and the efficiencies of the different systems that they're operating, interoperating with each other, and having greater confidence in the validity of the information that's being shared. Another key kind of benefit group is to government. So having an improved ability to detect and deter in particular security and privacy breaches. So we've been seeing that with more and more services going online, we're having an increase in those breaches. And so from a government point of view, it's wanting to have the ability to see what are the standards that are applying in that space, what's the protocols that organisations are going through to reduce the likelihood of those breaches occurring. And also, as Alan talked about as well, we have a commitment from the Prime Ministers in Australia and New Zealand for mutual recognition of digital identity. And so that alignment we're really seeing through the proposals that we have around the trust framework in particular. So we have a roadmap to mutual recognition with Australia, and just hugely beneficial that we're going through the legislative process at the same time too. They have just released a consultation paper on their legislation, which is up online if anyone's interested in seeing the proposals for their legislation. Then the fourth group of people, society is one of the other great benefiters from the digital identity ecosystem we're looking to set up for New Zealand, and that a big part of that is the interoperability between the digital identity services and being really clear about what are the rules that should apply in this space, and then the economic opportunities that brings. So I want to focus most of my talk on what the cabinet decisions are, which are in the paper that Alan mentioned, is up online. It's up on the, if you search kind of proactive release of a digital identity paper, you'll see the place on the Department of Internal Affairs website where you can see the decisions that were made in July. So the key part of those decisions is that we had approval to establish a trust framework in legislation, which kicks off a legislative process, which I'll talk through a bit more. We also got permission to start drafting and testing the trust framework rules, and so I'll talk about that a bit more as well. And then the third thing was around coming back to Cabinet with more information around proposals for government investment in digital identity services. So we see the development of the trust framework as one of the key interventions for getting us to that trusted, coherent and sustainable ecosystem, but that there's other interventions that government needs to consider as government as a provider of identity services, with the Real Me services being the current example of that. So this may be for some of you who we've met before, talking about when we talk about the trust framework in New Zealand. So this is the kind of basic infrastructure that we have for the proposed trust framework for New Zealand. On the left-hand side, we have 8 principles, and we see these principles as the enduring values that will enable us to get to that trusted, coherent, and sustainable ecosystem. So they're probably things that are not too surprising. They're kind of all motherhood and apple pie, but we see them as the kind of backbone that we always want to be referencing to see how we're going to get to that future state. So they're about being people-centered. So it's not people to the exclusion of everyone else, but people is kind of the number one part of this. Because when we're talking about that information sharing, it's personal information, but it's also organizational information, and also don't want to preclude kind of things or, you know, property. But it's just that the kind of first port of call is people, and that ties in quite nicely with inclusive as well. So we are talking about a digital world here, but we need to be cognizant that not everyone is in the digital space right now. And so we need to think about how we can enable that inclusion within the digital identity ecosystem that we're talking about, and that's also representative of the wider population. So in particular, thinking about our treaty partners and making sure that we are embedding to our Māori perspectives. The 2 other principles beyond that is secure and privacy enabling. Obviously, privacy and security are at the heart of what we're talking about here, and is a key part of enabling that trust and confidence across society in digital identity services. So they're a key part that we always need to reference back to as part of the trust framework. I started touching on the enabling to our Māori approaches to identity. So that's a key element that we're wanting to build in throughout the trust framework at every point, thinking about what are either those treaty requirements or those to our Māori interests or aspirations that we want to help reflect through the trust framework. Then we've got sustainability. So that's thinking about both the kind of economic sustainability of the trust framework and how that's built into, for example, any cost recovery around accreditation, but also that kind of ties in with the inclusiveness as well, that you want to get that wider range of voices to make sure that this is actually delivering for the wide range of stakeholders that we're talking about here. Then the last 2 is around interoperability. So that's obviously a key part of the benefits that we're seeking, that you're wanting everyone to be abiding by the same rules so that you can enable that interoperability between services, which often doesn't happen at the moment as people develop their own ad hoc and customized services to suit their purposes. They're not thinking about how it actually connects across the system. So that's a key principle that we want to have built in to the trust framework. And then the last one is about being open and transparent. So this is kind of for the first time bringing together what are the rules and how this ecosystem should operate. And so we want that to be clear for everyone to see. So those are our 8 principles. As I said, they're kind of our backbone and the enduring values that we want to see. And we will, when I get to the bill, we'll talk about what parts of this overview is in the different parts of the legislation. So on the right-hand side, we have the kind of components. So these are the kind of ways that we can help give effect to those principles on the left-hand side. And so the first part of that is the participants. So who are actually the participants in this trusted digital identity ecosystem? What roles would they play? Who would be accredited or assessed, and how would that operate? The second key component is the rules. So what are the rules that those accredited participants in particular will need to abide by in order to be players in the trusted ecosystem? And so I'll talk more about the rules development on the following slides as well. Another key element of the trust framework is an accreditation function. So that's to ensure that you've got rules, you've got participants. If you just leave it at that, that's nice, but you kind of can't do anything about it. So accreditation is the process of going through to ensure that you're actually abiding by the rules, and that there's some, the next component is around the legal enforcement, that you have some mechanisms to ensure that you've been accredited against the trust framework rules, but if you're found to be breaching those rules or no longer following them, that there are repercussions. Then the fifth component that we talk about is having a governance. So we want to try and have as representative a governance body as we can to make sure that those rules that the governance body would be responsible for are reflective of those principles and are enabling us to get to that trusted, coherent and sustainable ecosystem in New Zealand. So that's kind of like my overview slide of how the trust framework could operate. And over the next few slides, I'll talk about how the process we're going through to actually implement that in practice. So the first part of it all, who are the participants that we're talking about? Often when we kind of talk about digital identity, people don't really, or you talk about an ecosystem, they're like, what are you talking about with the ecosystem? This is pretty much our ecosystem diagram here, where we've got the trust framework wrapped around it all as the way to create the trust and confidence and the rules that the different participants would need to abide by. But what we have as the participants is right front and center are the users. So it's all about user initiated and user consented sharing of information. So they're a key part of the participants within the ecosystem, but they're not a participant that we propose will be accredited under the trust framework. That's more the role of the other participants that I'll talk through. But the users kick it all off. So the users are wanting to get information from the information providers on the left-hand side. So they supply the personal and organizational information that we want to be sharing across the ecosystem. And so those information providers are government agencies. So thinking about identity information, your kind of core one for New Zealand is the Department of Internal Affairs, but it's also thinking about information that banks hold about you, such as your account number or your account details, or that other individuals have about you, or information from your utilities company. So information providers is a wide range of providers in that space. And that's something we always talk to with the trust framework too, that this would apply to government agencies and private sector organizations as well. It's not just about sorting out how you can share information across government. So the kind of second grouping of participants that the third grouping, sorry, after users and information providers is the ones in blue that I have at the bottom of the diagram there. We kind of loosely call them the infrastructure providers, and that includes login providers. So that's the providers that are giving you the keys to access and manage your information. Those providers that provide like data access and binding to ensure that you can actually get the information that you're seeking to share and that you can confirm that you are connected to that information. And then the third group within that is the kind of sharing infrastructure. So what are the tools that you're actually using to get that information shared across the ecosystem? So one of the concepts we talk about there is things such as digital wallets. So the last group of participants we have within the ecosystem are the relying parties. So those are the organizations that want to consume that trusted personal and organizational information to provide services. And again, you'll see here that there's a wide range of providers in that space. So it is government agencies, but it's also banks, it's travel, it's transport, you name it, someone's going to want to have some kind of confirmed information from you when you're applying for a service or seeking to purchase something. So for the relying parties within the trust framework, we'd see that there's some kind of assessment process that you'd go through to become a trusted player within the ecosystem, but it might not be as kind of detailed and as intensive as the information providers and the infrastructure providers. So these are all things that we'll tease out as we develop the rules in particular, but as part of with our alien colleagues who are already further down this path, one of the examples for relying parties is setting up like a self-assessment tool online so that you can confirm that you're meeting the terms and conditions. There's different ways that we can go about doing the assessment for relying parties rather than necessarily like a full accreditation process. So that's just a bit of a flavour of the participants that we see in the trust framework. And I'll go to talking about the rules. So the rules, we're in the process of scaling up the team right now to draft up the rules. And we have a governance group with government representatives at the moment who will be kind of overseeing the decision making around the rules, because we'd have the governance group as responsible for maintaining and updating the rules as part of the statutory trust framework. we're drafting up the rules through a process called Better Rules. So I'm happy to share some links around about that. So there's one of the government departments, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, and our Inland Revenue Department have been big promoters of the Better Rules process, which is a methodology that it ensures that you have that rigor and traceability when you're developing rules, and that there's a really clear methodology around being super clear on your glossary, what are the different roles, what are the different processes, and what are the concepts that you're talking about, and keeping them kind of distinct and separate from then drafting up the rules, which would be outlining what's the behavior you're seeking or what's the decisions that you're wanting to be made. So we're just really kicking off and getting deep into that Better Rules process to establish what the rules would be for the different participants within the ecosystem. And a key part of that is that we want them to be standards-based as much as possible. So that's reflecting that there's existing standards, in particular standards that are recommended or mandated for government agencies in particular. So one of the sets of standards we talk about is the Identification Management Standards, which is an updated suite of standards in New Zealand. So we'd see that those standards would be a key reference point into those rules. So we're just teasing out what are those different standards that should apply, and then how we then build the rules out based on those largely existing standards, but also thinking about developing standards. So another example of developing standards are those through W3C around decentralized identifiers in particular, because we're keen for the ecosystem to be reflective of the different implementations and the different models within the digital identity world, thinking about centralized and decentralized approach. So a key part of drafting up the rules is that we want to get a first draft up and running. So we're aiming to have the first draft ready by March. And we're also working we've done a kind of call out to kind of known providers. So if there's any other providers out there who this sounds interesting to you, please do get in contact with us. So we're wanting to set up a pilot program where we can test out those draft rules with existing providers to see how workable they actually are in practice. So thinking about what would the compliance requirements be to show that you're abiding by the rules, and how do they work in practice to make sure that we're getting that balance right between having all the kind of privacy and security and identification management standards and levels at a kind of a space that government's comfortable with, but actually in a way that doesn't preclude a range of different providers and isn't setting the bar so high that this trusted ecosystem actually can't really function. So we've really got that opportunity over the next year while the legislation's being drafted to really draft and test out those rules. So they won't be any of those pilot programs. It's all a testing and iterating and learning environment. There's no formal accreditation under the trust framework as part of that rules development, because we can't have a legally binding rules until the legislation is passed. But we do have that opportunity to do the testing. And that's important as part of the legislative process too, so that as we're developing the bill and taking that through the select committee, that they have visibility of what those draft rules could be and have a better sense of what it's all about. Because in those rules and participants is really the depth of what we're talking about here. So you'll see that a bit when I talk about the bill on the next slide. So as you'll see from the cabinet paper, we have permission to set up the trust framework in legislation. So so we're going through that process at the moment. So we said that there'll be a bill introduced next year with the category 3. That's what the proposal is, but we're working through that right now. So the cabinet paper talked about wanting to have the principles reflected in the legislation and wanting to outline what's the governance model. So thinking about how that governance board would be structured, what would their powers and functions be, and the same thing with the accreditation authority, what would their powers and functions be, and how would those enforcement mechanisms operate, such as offences and penalties and liability. So we're just working through proposals for how the trust framework bill could operate at the moment. But that will be kind of contingent on ministers' decisions and legislative timetables and things like that. But those are the kind of the elements that are highlighted in the slide there are the elements that we'd look to put into that primary legislation. And as I said, we'll take that bill through to get these parts into the primary legislation, and in parallel draft up the rules and test out how they would operate. because the rules would most likely be in secondary or tertiary legislation through a regulation making power. So the last part of the Cabinet decisions is around what we call the operational response Cabinet paper, which probably means nothing to anyone else. But this is looking at what are some of the other interventions that government could look at, and what could its investment be in digital identity services, and in particular thinking about the future of the Realme services. So as Alan said earlier, we'll be providing advice in the new year around that to ministers. So that's my summary of the kind of the Cabinet decisions from July, and kind of where we're at and how we intend to implement the trust framework and the kind of key components of it, and especially those principles. And so now would really welcome your feedback on any of that, or any questions that you may have for myself or Alan or Tony, who's here as well. So I'll stop here.
Emma, that's pretty amazing, and you do love this stuff, don't you? That was
it's been nearly 2 years now in this space. It's a long time.
It is a long time, but it's also incredibly complex, right? I think that's part of the challenge and part of what you're trying to navigate through now. So really appreciate, obviously, your hard work, but the ability to connect all this stuff together as well. So there are a couple of questions that have popped up. So one is about early use of the framework. You've sort of addressed this in your presentation, but it's worthwhile dwelling on. So early use of the framework, like in a sandbox type environment, prior to ironing out the regulatory changes needed.
Yeah, so that's so pretty much we don't have we're not proposing that we do kind of technical testing right away. The kind of first step is the pilot program, where it would be like a paper-based exercise of if these were the rules and if these were your compliance requirements, how would that work from your perspective? So that's why we're setting up that pilot program with interested providers who will be keen to kind of test out the rules for us. So that's, yeah, the proposal, to try and kind of test it out before it goes into any regulations.
Okay, and you sort of you mentioned as well that the enabling legislation, or the Digital Identity Bill, has got some pretty substantive provisions in it. So you can't almost do things in pilot mode. You have to have the legislation in place, right?
No, so we can test and we can draft. Like we could. So the whole purpose is, while the legislation is going through the House, which should be happening next year, we can test out what the rules could be, but we just can't have them as legally enforceable rules. Yeah, it's all just like a testing and hypothetical environment, rather than, yeah.
Yes, and that's what I was getting to. It was the legal enforcement bit.
So then,
referred to.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's another question regarding.
So there's another question here about.
Yeah, the timeframes. So clearly there's the Digital Identity Bill itself, but that's not all encompassing, right? There's a whole lot of intricacies in terms of the legislation and regulations that are involved. So how are you feeling about that?
So the Trust Framework Bill is the primary mechanism, because this is going to be creating a new piece of legislation of how the Trust Framework will operate. So part of considering that is thinking about if there's any other impact on other legislation as part of that. So that's a process that we're working through as well. So the kind of the time frame for this is in the Cabinet paper. We've proposed for the bill to be introduced to the House next year with Category 3, which is for it to be passed within the year. But that's up to, there's like a process that you go through to get the category for your bill, which we're working on at the moment. And then, so once you've got the primary legislation in place, you'd have things such as regulation making powers, if that's the path we go down. And so then you need to go through the process for that to formalise the trust framework rules and that secondary legislation. So the proposed timeline is over the next 18 months for that. So having that ready to go by the middle of 2022, which is what the paper outlines as well. Cool.
And in terms of that sort of initial work that you've been doing, looking at all of the regulations and the associated pieces of legislation, have you got a count? Is there an idea of how extensive that is, and how how we've got these quirky little rooms all over the place that we need to adjust?
Yeah, we're scoping that out at the moment. So the main focus is getting the primary legislation in place, and then we'll see what's the other things that we can pick up in other legislation. But that's just, it's still in scoping mode at the moment.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Another question relates to, I guess you talked about being in a recruiting phase. This might be one for Tony or Alan, or for you, or any of you, really. So building a team, you also referred to the Better Rules model, and obviously that some of the originating work from that came from the Service Innovation Lab when it was in play. So in terms of the people that you're bringing into the process, who are you looking for? What talent are you bringing to the fore here in terms of the size and the scale and the qualities of that team?
Yeah, so we're just doing the final confirming of appointments for the team right now. But yeah, really, so there was a question there about the Better Rules models from the DIA Service Innovation Lab, absolutely connecting in with the lessons learned from there. And that's what kind of MB and IRD have taken over. And there's a communities of practice around that. So the team that I've recruited is they're kind of like an operational policy team with a mix of experience in the Better Rules process and developing business rules. So they either have that deep experience in the Better Rules process or deep experience in regulatory regimes, but each of them have like a passion for really having a good crack at the Better Rules process for New Zealand. Because anyone who's familiar with what the Innovation Lab was looking at is they're talking about legislation as code. So with the kind of rigorous methodology that the Better Rules process offers, is that the rules at the end of the day should be rules that can be machine readable. And so that has a number of benefits for the providers that need to comply with the rules, that it's much clearer what's the logic, what's the chain of transmission back to those standards and any legislation that we were referring to in particular. So it makes it really a lot easier to comply with and a lot clearer about what it's all about and where it's come from and why it's structured that way. And then there's that next step of you can then have that set up as code. I don't really know how all that part works, but it sounds good. So that then you can automate systems a lot more, and it's just kind of the whole flow of the system of having the rules and complying with the rules and then matching that up to your own business processes or your own business requirements is a lot more clear and smooth and kind of efficient. So there's also the added benefit. I understand that you have legislation as code. It's also easier to translate as well because it's kind of the English is really clear. So it's really easy to put that into Te Reo or to put that into other languages. And that's the whole thing with code, is that that's just like another language as well. So we're really excited about working with those who've got expertise in this area and experience to get that done.
Testing too, right? Because you take those edge cases, the stress cases that David started with, and does this still work if you have this situation? Does it work?
Yeah.
In category? Does it work in an anonymized provision? So yeah, it's a good approach. Really pleased that you're taking that. David's actually posed a question in the chat as well. So what are some examples of rules that will be tested? Do you mean things like opening bank accounts?
No, of the rules that will be tested, it's the rules that will apply to the different, so whatever role you're performing within the ecosystem, it's like, what are the rules that you need to abide by? And so we think about the categories around like, what's the kind of identification management practices, what's the privacy, what's the security? It's those kind of rules. We want the rules to apply no matter what the kind of use case is, so that they can work across all those different systems. So testing them out will be testing with the providers that need to show that they're abiding by the rules. It's more at that kind of higher level.
And I did have a question on that too, as you were going through talking about that invite for providers to engage with you and be part of that validation process, that testing process as well. So when you say providers, and I know you had some of this in your slides, what type of organisations are you looking to engage? Who's your dream team, right? That you want to have knocking on your door and saying, yeah, I want to be working with you.
Yeah, well, it's thinking about that participant slide that we had about the different groups, the information providers, the infrastructure providers, and then thinking about some key relying parties that we could test that out with as well. So the information providers is this kind of core information that government holds. So that's thinking about DIA, that's quite handy. We know some people in there, so that's good. Or kind of immigration and education. It's thinking about those kind of key attributes that you might want to access and share. From the kind of sharing tools, it's people that are developing things like digital wallets or have some kind of element of like data access and binding that they're doing well. So it can be like something that's got the whole package of enabling that, that sharing of information across the board, or one element of it. So we already have, I think, 20 organisations on the list for the pilot program, and we'll work through the process of who we can proceed with as part of that kind of formal testing environment next year.
Perfect, great, and that's good. It's good to have that clarity under there as well. A question we got from Ben, interested in what the accreditation process will be or might be. Who gets to decide who's accredited or not?
So that's part of the proposals that we have in the bill of kind of what's the powers and functions of the accreditation authority in particular. So we're proposing that there's an accreditation authority, and so the bill is working through where that responsibility will sit. So that will most likely be within like a government agency. And so that's part of the setting up the infrastructure for the trust framework in legislation, is being really clear who's got that responsibility, how does that accountability work, you know, what's the role of the governance board compared to ministers, compared to kind of transparency through the legislature. So that's things that we're teasing out through the bill, but there'll be like an accreditation team, but there could be the ability to certify others to do that accreditation as well. But that's the whole purpose of working through the legislation, to really tease out what are those powers and functions and making sure that that's super clear for everyone.
And you mentioned some international connection there, the cross affiliation type thing as well. So somebody who's got a solution that works in one market, how applicable might that be, right? Is that what you meant when you were talking about?
Well, so yeah, if there's any provider that wants to be accredited under the trust framework.
Sorry, we got a lag.
Yeah, it's showing how they would abide by the rules in the New Zealand trust framework. Yeah, sorry, I think we just had some delay there.
We did. All good. We're back. I think we're back in sync. And final question I wanted to leave you with was one about, and it's a theme that's come out throughout here, is the explainability of this to the general public, and the education which is associated with that, helping people along the journey so that this becomes practical, usable, and we actually build the trust. So what are your thoughts? That's a big question, right? But what are your thoughts in terms of how you and the team are going about engaging in that process?
I'll pass you over to Alan for this one.
Excellent. Yeah, I thought it might be an Alan question. It's what keeps him up at night, right?
Actually, very well, Andrew, thank you. We're about to sync, so I'm just worried that we're probably freezing a bit, but look, I think this has to be a joint whole of New Zealand type effort, you know, so we have to talk about what DENS can do, what states of government can do. So certainly happy to get into that just through the early part of next year.
Perfect, and you are right, you are lagging a bit. You're clearly using up a lot of bandwidth in the DIA with all of the work and the engagement you've been doing. But yeah, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity as well. Hey, we are going to draw things to a close.
Thank you.
So thank you, Alan, Emma, and Tony hiding in the background. Yeah, like I say, it's been a pleasure working with you over the past couple of years, actually. And really appreciate the open approach and the invitation to be involved in the process. And look forward to that continuing as well. So yeah, big thumbs up to the work you're doing and the approach you're taking as well. So really pleased with that. Now we are going to, as I say, bring things to a close.
Andrew,
Yes. I'm sorry, can you repeat? Sorry, we just missed that.
Really appreciate.
Sorry, we're losing the connection, I'm afraid. Cool. There is a question about how we can get involved. So we will. We can make those connections after this. The team are looking for the opportunity for people to engage with them. So we will provide that information to everybody, which is a good segue. In terms of wrapping up here, we are coming very much to the end of our time. So I really want to thank everybody for your attention, for your attendance, for your participation, for your questions, for the chat, for the nature of the discussion. We will be making all of this material available to you and to your colleagues who weren't able to make it necessarily for the live session. So we have recorded these things. We'll make the presentations available, and any information we've got in terms of the links and the ability to get involved in different things, we'll package it up and share as well. We'll also be seeking your feedback. This is clearly quite well, everyone's sort of used to webinars at the moment, but this is a bit of a bigger webinar, if you like, in the Hui format. So looking for a bit of feedback in terms of how things have worked and how we might improve things as well for the future. So looking, at those sort of things. I do want to acknowledge too the work of the partners and the supporters who particularly have worked with us on this. So I mentioned Payments New Zealand, obviously, and the role that they played in bringing David and Bianca. Thank you so much for doing that. For Internet New Zealand, and I know there's a big crew from Internet New Zealand who are here, both the community and staff members. I know we've also got a massive contingent from the BNZ, so shout out to you guys as well. And thank you, Amy, for your continued work and advocacy and sharing the knowledge around the teams. And similarly, Westpac, Naveen and the team, there's a bunch of you on the call as well. So really want to thank you, you guys in particular, for getting behind the work and what we're doing here.